Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Robert Krueger. He is distinguished McKnight University professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Minnesota. And today we're going to talk about the classification of disorders in psychiatry, the hierarchical taxonomy of psychopathology, personality, subjective well-being, and other related topics. So, Dr. Krueger, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Yeah, thanks again for inviting me.
So, let's start by talking a little bit about nosology, psychiatric nosology, or how the classification of mental disorders is done in psychiatry. So, what do you think of the way psychiatric nosology works today?
So I suppose we could start with the sort of official nosologies. I guess that's where you're headed with this question. Yeah. So, descriptive psychiatry has a rich history and has functioned historically in a way that's similar to how medicine has functioned, which is to say that clinical observation is the bedrock of the classification system, right? So clinicians encounter patients, they see patients who have similar features, and then based on that, they start to describe criteria for, patients who present with similar kinds of complaints or features. And, throughout the history of medicine, that kind of approach has been fairly productive, especially during the 20th century, because many of those syndromes were fairly tight in their organization and had an etiology that was fairly circumscribed. Right. So, for example, you can encounter patients who have similar features. You can use 20th century style technology to, examine potential correlates, right? Like, for instance, looking at blood samples under a microscope and so on, and find a key pathogen, right? Or some sort of specific factor that then leads to this, presentation of symptoms. And I don't mean to oversimplify, somatic medicine, because there are many things in that realm that are considerably more complicated in terms of their etiology and pathophysiology. But, to make a long story short, that's the paradigm, right, that has influenced psychiatric classification in a way that's similar to medicine, in as much as psychiatry is, in fact, a branch of medicine. So that has, that results in the kinds of classification systems that most people are familiar with that are issued by authoritative bodies, most notably the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or DSM, and the very similarly organized International Classification of Disease, which is published by the World Health Organization. Right, and so in those systems, diagnoses are arranged into categories, and those categories are delineated by criteria. And the idea basically is that these things exist in nature as categories, and based on the presence or absence of a fixed number of criteria from a more extensive set, right? For example, there may be 9 criteria and the threshold for diagnosis is having at least 5. Using that kind of rubric, right, the clinician is meant to utilize that kind of system to arrive at an appropriate diagnosis. And in comparing potential diagnostic labels, the clinician is meant to engage in the process of differential diagnosis, right? So there may be similar presentations, but subtle differences, right? And the process of diagnosis is to determine what the most optimal, and generally speaking, singular, right, diagnostic label would be for any given clinical presentation. So that's the system that sort of exists in psychiatry. And that system has wide influence over all mental health disciplines.
So one highly debated question has to do with what a mental disorder is. So what is it? I mean, what is your approach to this question? What are your thoughts about it?
Maybe you could say a little more specifically, my thoughts about what specifically, maybe.
I mean, the question of what a mental disorder is, what it means.
That's a very deep question. It's hard to answer it in a succinct manner because many brilliant people have written about this issue and tried to come up with an internally consistent definition. Thanks to the prompting of my colleague and friend Colin DeYoung, it is something that I've tried to think about and write about more recently. And Colin and I have perspective on this that we call the cybernetic perspective. And the idea there basically is that when an organism that's goal-directed, like a human being, right, encounters circumstances that are incompatible with their goals, they often experience a sense of distress or misalignment. And then, it's that kind of process of encountering things that are incompatible with one's goals that leads to the kind of distress, right, that might be the essence of, not feeling well in a psychological sense. And then psychopathology from that perspective emerges when the person, use people as an example here, right? Like when the person is unable to generate novel strategies or approaches to realize a different set of goals or to realize a different way of approaching their goals. And so I think that's kind of how we've started to think about it. So similar to other people's, definitions, there's, the symptom presentation per se, but that's not, sufficient to say that psychopathology is present. There also has to be a thwartedness about it, right? So I guess that's been our perspective, but most perspectives have key similarities, right? So a typical definition is not just that there are symptoms present, but also that those symptoms are debilitating, right? So there has to be, for instance, social and occupational dysfunction that goes along with a sense of, with a presentation of problematic, psychiatric symptoms.
So you mentioned Dr. Colin DeYoung. I've had him on the show twice, and we talked a lot about personality traits, for example, and their relationship to psychopathology. So do individual differences have any bearing on how we understand and study psychopathology? And if so, what is the relationship here?
Right. So I guess your question is generally about the relationship between personality and psychopathology.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Again, you picked a very deep topic, right, on which there's a tremendous literature. I guess my thinking about it is that these are very closely related concepts because we sort of know this from a number of different angles, right? So based on just phenotypic presentation, we could call it, right? So we could say there's a literature on personality, there's a literature on psychopathology. These literatures have evolved somewhat independently, and the assessments that have been developed from both perspectives are putting people into individual difference, rankings in a way that's very similar, right? So a personality questionnaire that's meant to get at a neuroticism trait often has, items on it that are very similar to the items on something like a symptom checklist for anxiety and depression. So it may be the case that the sort of de facto distinction has to do with something like time scale, right? So personality traits are often thought of as reasonably consistent and enduring. And psychopathology is often thought of as having more time varying features, right? So that it's not typical for a person to be continually in an episode of psychopathology, but rather people sort of wax and wane in their presentation over time based on what's happening in their lives. So that's probably the kind of key distinction, something about the time scale. But, speaking, kind of clinically, it's very difficult for me to think about a patient, or a client in a way that doesn't recognize their dispositional features. Even if their current functioning is somewhat different from their typical functioning, right? Their symptom profile, the way in which they're presenting with things, is embedded in their dispositions. So there's a very intimate relationship between personality and psychopathology. And the way I tend to think about it, and this is, I think, well supported by the evidence, is that personality is kind of the organizing structure for the presentation of symptoms. But I don't want to go as far as to say the concepts are entirely fungible or interchangeable, because there are some important distinctions historically between the concepts. So hopefully that kind of addresses your question in a succinct way.
Mm-hmm. So could you tell us about the Hierarchical Taxonomy of Psychopathology project? I mean, what is it? What is it about? How did it start? And what are its goals exactly?
Right. So the HiTOP, the Hierarchical Taxonomy of Psychopathology project started almost a decade ago now. And the way it got started really was that my colleague and friend Roman Kotov, right, had this idea that plenty of people were doing this work on trying to figure out kind of the structure of psychopathology. And that work kind of had to do with figuring out if there was consistency to patterns of comorbidity that were shown among DSM-defined entities. So going back to our discussion of the DSM and categorical classification, in spite of the sort of basic underlying premise that you can choose the most optimal, single categorical descriptive label for any given patient, literature had emerged showing that that's very difficult to do, practically speaking, particularly in psychiatric epidemiology, where the goal is to figure out, the prevalence of different kinds of categorical diagnoses in the general population. So those studies did away with the attempt to have very strict hierarchical exclusionary rules among the categories, because it's very hard to apply them in a way that makes conceptual or clinical sense. So instead, you kind of assign the diagnostic labels that seem appropriate for the person's complaints or presentation or endorsement of criteria in an interview. And so you get these patterns of comorbidity. And we could talk a little bit about comorbidity, right? What does that term really mean? It's a little bit of a misnomer in my way of thinking about it, because comorbidity just, means that you have two, diagnoses at the same time, given whatever time frame it is you're considering the comorbidity in terms of. This could happen just because two things have very high base rates, right? So, plenty of people who meet criteria for depression are also myopic, because these are commonly observed conditions. You can figure out the prevalence of the joint condition just from the product of the base rates of the two conditions, right? So the base rate of A multiplied by the base rate of B gives you the probability that someone's going to have both things if they're not correlated with each other. But the phenomenon, right, in psychiatric epidemiology that had been observed is more that these diagnoses are correlated with each other. So that means that they're co-occurring at rates that are greater than would be predicted simply from the product of the base rates. So what you see in those kinds of psychiatric epi data is persons who have diagnoses, well, I should say, like, you see that there's correlations essentially among diagnoses. So you have many more people with multiple conditions than you would get if you just worked out all the base rate products, right? And it's those patterns of correlation that kind of gave rise to the structural literature that was the initial inspiration for the HiTOP consortium, where it becomes clear if you start to study this stuff that there are patterns that are both hierarchical in terms of the sort of organization of individual differences in psychopathological propensities, as well as dimensional, right? So we can work through those two concepts a little bit here if you want, right? So the idea of hierarchy is very familiar to researchers in individual differences in areas like personality and mental abilities. And it's basically that if you look at patterns of correlations, a good way to model them is from very fine-grained individual difference variables. So in the world of psychopathology, that could be particular symptom clusters, right? Like anhedonia, for example, like something that's pretty specific. But then those things have patterns of correlation that are pretty psychologically meaningful. And the psychological meaning of those correlations is distinctive from the DSM's organizational structure. That gets really interesting, right? Back to the question about personality in psychopathology. So to make a long story short, if you start to look at patterns of correlation among psychopathological experiences, you get a structure that's very similar to the structure of human personality. Maybe seen through a darker lens, right? Because you're asking about the maladaptive aspects of personality expressions. But you kind of see something similar to the well-known Big Five, just the maladaptive aspects of those Big Five tendencies. So there's pretty good evidence now that that's the structure of psychopathology, right? It's not what the DSM imposes, right, or claims, which would be something more like this kind of linear organization of categories in these putatively separate chapters that are studied in these distinctive literatures. Rather, the patterns, right, of correlation among mental disorder diagnoses look a lot like the patterns of personality that you see in the general population. So again, getting back to HiTOP, the way that that effort came about was to say that, okay, a bunch of us were doing this work. We knew each other and were publishing productively kind of in independent groups, but it made sense to bring everybody together in a consortium, particularly to articulate a more comprehensive and empirically based classification system that wasn't constrained by the traditions of the DSM, right? So in DSM, basically through fiat, right, like by definition, just because that's how authorities have put together the manual, these things are supposed to be categories, but they might not be. So that's the hierarchical part, right? These things tend to be organized from very narrow, specific symptom clusters all the way up to broad individual difference variables that you might think of as a spectrum of interrelated conditions. And in addition, there's a related literature that tries to ask, okay, if we have these patterns of symptoms, what kind of a model would fit the patterning we're observing in data? This stuff gets a little technical, but basically there's ways to compare models that have the underlying distribution as more categorical or discrete would be maybe a better word for it, right? That there are discrete groupings of probability masses in the underlying distribution versus that it's more continuous and smooth. So that's another strong empirical basis for the perspective that is sort of underlying the HiTOP effort, right? So, to make a long story short, you can formally compare dimensional and categorical models of psychopathological variation. When you do this formal comparison, there's a substantial literature showing that things are generally better fit by dimensional models than they are fit by more discrete or categorical kinds of models. So those two robust empirical observations, right, that things tend to be dimensional in the world of psychopathology and that they're pretty well organized into a hierarchy, form the basis for the HiTOP effort and provide an empirically based approach to classification of psychopathology that's an alternative to the constraints, right, that exist primarily by tradition in, psychiatric nosologies. Maybe one, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Yes, just finish what you were going to say.
Well, I was just going to say, like, how has HiTOP evolved? HiTOP has evolved into a situation where there are two related efforts, right? There's the HiTOP Research Consortium, right, which is people working on particular topics inspired by the HiTOP model. There are work groups, for instance, on genetics and neuroscience and so on and so forth, right, where the idea is to take those fields and merge them with the HiTOP perspective on phenotypic organization of psychopathology, right? That's the consortium part. But there's also a society that's formed now, right? So a scientific society where the idea is that there will be annual meetings and people pay dues and they come to the meetings and present their research. And I would encourage people to go to the HiTOP webpage. I'm sure we can put the URL into the show notes or something like this. But if you're interested in this kind of thing, it's possible to get involved in either or both the society, right, which is, again, like a scientific organization, or the consortium, which is, a more of a group focused on the science and scholarship. So the new members are always welcome, and I would encourage people who are interested in what I'm talking about here to think about joining. That's my point.
So in this taxonomy, what are symptoms and how do you deal with them, and what are the differences between symptoms and traits?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think that's challenging in the way that we were discussing earlier in this conversation. But in short, that distinction is pretty fuzzy. It probably has something to do with the time scale on which these things are presented. But both kinds of constructs are sitting within the HiTOP hierarchy, right? So traits, again, are more like a disposition to engage in a behavior over time, right? Kind of a probability, right? That a person's going to be in a given state at any given point in time over some aggregate amount of time. Whereas symptoms might be thought of as more like things that change more from time to time. So classic examples, right, are things like self-harm, right? So self-harm tends not to be entirely trait-like, although some people can be very persistent in their self-harming tendencies. There's more variation over time in how intensely people are engaging in that specific and circumscribed set of, very troubling behaviors. Whereas the disposition, right, to want to harm oneself is coming from, neuroticism and distress and, qualities like that the person might have as a disposition over longer chunks of time. So that, I think, is kind of the distinction within HiTOP, right? Symptoms are more like things that come and go, and traits are more like things that are more consistent over time, but they're meaningfully related to each other, because the probability of having a symptom emerges from the position that one has on a trait-like construct. And the key to moving this discussion forward is fine-grained longitudinal data, which many people involved in HiTOP are very interested in. Challenging data to collect, but kind of the key to unraveling these timescales. Does that make sense? So, like, if you really want to understand in an empirically based way the different timescales of different human propensities to different behaviors, you got to study people in an intensive longitudinal fashion, right? You got to study them closely over both shorter time frames and longer time frames to figure out what kind of behaviors tend to be like this, right? Like they come and go, and what kind of behaviors are more consistent. And that gets, it's very important, but it's very challenging, because you can imagine that different people, right, are going to have different patterns. And so there's just a lot of different possibilities within that space. And it's an active area of research at this time.
Mm-hmm. And how do you approach etiology and causal influences, including genetic and environmental influences, in this model of psychopathology?
So etiology specifically, is that what you're thinking about here?
Mm-hmm.
Like, yeah, so that's you really hit on kind of the key topics and the most challenging areas. But sure, like, we can try to get some purchase here on the concept of etiology, right? So when I think about, etiology, I'm thinking about it in terms of more distal causes and also more proximal causes. And I think that distinction between things that are further in the past and things that are more, close by in the person's, history, is pretty important. So when I think about the distal etiology, I'm often thinking about, genomics, right? I think there's, plenty of evidence that a key part of the distal etiology of psychopathology is sitting in the human genome, which, absent something terrible happening to people like irradiation, right, is going to be consistent through your life. And those, causal factors can be studied now, given modern molecular genetic technologies. And so that's a key part of the distal etiology of psychopathology, right, is the complement that a person has of genomic variants that, in a very complex and multifaceted way, right? So we know that from genomics too, right, that none of these causes are very discrete and specific. Rather, there's a bunch of different segments of DNA, oftentimes at the level of even single nucleotide polymorphisms, that kind of add up to give a person a position on a trait-like, kind of dimension. That is probably a key part of the distal etiology, but that's, of course, only part of the equation, because it's not just DNA as, the only driving force behind a person's propensities to experience psychopathology. It also obviously has a lot to do with environmental experiences that are often correlated with, right? So this gets tricky too, right? Because the environment is not necessarily completely independent of the genome. People are exposed to environments that are correlated with their genomes. Mm-hmm. So there's gene-environment correlation active also, as well as the potential for gene-environment interactions. right? So the exposures might be such that the person's genetic propensity is enhanced or kind of suppressed by environmental exposures like stress experiences and so on and so forth, right? So that all gets kind of hairy and complicated, but that's unfortunately the nature of the material we're dealing with, right? Psychopathology is not simple to study. It's multifaceted in its etiology. It has both distal and proximal components, right? So things that are further in the past and things that are more proximal. And to develop a realistic, empirically based model of how genes and environments come together to influence psychopathological propensities is obviously the holy grail, right, in terms of understanding the etiology of psychopathology, but pretty difficult to accomplish in a kind of tractable, manageable, replicable, scientific way. Nevertheless, I think that's the task in front of us, right, is to combine technologies that are coming from genomics with an intensive understanding of exposures, right, as an epidemiologist might call them, right, so environmental experiences, to articulate more evidence-based models of how genes and environments come together to influence what a person's particular symptom profile might be like at any given point in time.
So let me ask you a different kind of question now. How would a classification of mental disorders look like within the framework of a hierarchical taxonomy?
Right. So kind of what's the diagnostic process given a HiTOP type of model? Is that kind of what you're asking?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think the key distinction to appreciate between classical DSM style differential diagnosis as the clinical task and the sort of HiTOP classification scheme as the clinical task is that in the HiTOP scheme, things are both dimensional and multidimensional, right? So we could start with the classic paradigm in the way that you're sort of taught to do this when you're being trained clinically, right? Is, you know, interview the patient, take a good history, and try to figure out, based on the clinical data available to you, the best diagnostic label, right? Best being defined as, okay, consider the hundreds and hundreds of categories that are sitting in something like the DSM. Consider a careful differential diagnosis kind of approach, right? Like, so is this closer to, you know, something like major depression with recurrent episodes, or is it closer to something like generalized anxiety disorder, even though those, you know, syndromes have overlapping features, which they clearly do in terms of the, you know, criteria for the disorders. But you're supposed to consider things like, well, what's the balance between, you know, sort of low mood experiences and more activated, you know, kind of anxiety experiences. And you can try to do this, but with real people, it doesn't work well, right? It's something I've been very interested in as a clinician, right? So the way I got to a lot of what I'm interested in is trying to do this, right? Working with patients, trying to be, you know, a good student of the psychiatric classification type system, right? Trying to use it effectively to find the right diagnosis, and finding that it's very difficult to pick the one, right, optimal diagnostic label. So then turning to the more hierarchical, you know, HiTOP kind of approach, it's more like a profile. So instead of saying like you belong in this category and not these nearby ones, it's more like, all right, let's look at the key dimensions that have been identified in people and position the person based on the assessment data within those dimensions. So you end up more with like a profile, and that handles problems of comorbidity and differential diagnosis much more deftly, in my view, than the differential diagnosis paradigm. So you would have a pattern, right, across the major, you know, spectra, right, that have been developed in HiTOP. You could think about the presentation of different levels of resolution, right? That's the hierarchical part, right? Where's the person on these big, broad spectrums? And clinically, often you want to know more like the fine-grained elements, because that's more clinically useful, right? To have some fine-grained information. And you don't have to deal with the differential diagnosis problem, which is often frustrating, and has been a thorn in the side of psychiatric classification for as long as people have tried to do it, right? So there are these interstitial, right, in between psychiatric categories that have a checkered history, and anybody trying to make sense of them. Schizoaffective disorder is a classic example of this, right? What do you do when a person is not very clearly mood disordered versus very clearly having a psychotic type of, episode? And DSM handles this by having lots of different categories having to do with the time course and relative balance of those experiences. That is hard, right? Because people don't fit neatly into those categories. And you still end up with people who have prominent mood disorder symptoms and prominent reality testing type symptoms. And then what we consider, you're not really supposed to use schizoaffective very often because it's an uncomfortable thing where you're not really making a clear decision. In something like HiTOP, there's no need for such, hand-wringing about the right diagnostic category. Rather, you have people with different balances of mood problems and psychotic problems, and it just falls naturally into the possibility that people may be elevated in two different spectrums simultaneously. And that's much closer to what the phenotypes, right, the clinical presentations look like in data, right? That's the empirical basis for the HiTOP approach. And I could go further and say, the evidence from genetic research, certainly from the twin studies, right, and now emerging also from the molecular studies, is that these things aren't highly discrete and separable in the way that's implied by the classical categorical classification system. But it requires a change of focus, right? It requires the clinician to be thinking more about dimensional profiles and less about optimal, categories, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. So in your work, I also read about the general factor of psychopathology, or how to go from individual symptoms up to a general factor of psychopathology. So what is it? What is a general factor of psychopathology?
This is a concept that emerges from the evidence that everything that has historically been called psychopathology is positively correlated with everything else. Different degrees, right? So the degrees of correlation is what gives you evidence for the hierarchy, right? Not everything is correlated to the same degree. So this gets, again, sort of technical and statistical, but maybe I can describe it verbally, a little bit. If it were the case that all the psychopathology symptoms, right, like everything that's in the criteria of the DSM, were all correlated with each other to the same degree, then you would say, well, okay, it's a parsimonious way to describe that data matrix by saying there's one thing, and it manifests in lots of different ways, but there's really kind of like one thing that's driving all of this. Whereas what you really see in data are that they're correlated all positively, right? They're rarely negatively correlated or zero correlated, because everything is correlated at least a little bit with everything else in psychopathology. But there are denser groups of correlations. And it's that patterning of the density versus sparsity, if you will, right, of different patternings that gives rise to the hierarchy. But nevertheless, at the highest level of the hierarchy, right, you can posit the existence of a general propensity to experience all of psychopathology because there is evidence that everything is positively correlated with everything else. So this is a long way of saying that it's not nonsensical to think about a general propensity given that kind of data structure, but it's very abstract, right? Because you're talking about everything being correlated with everything else. I think the key to getting your head around this, right, is that there's a hierarchy. It doesn't consist of just one general factor. It consists of factors arranged in this hierarchical kind of arrangement. And why that's important is because, well, it's important for every possible reason, right? Like if you want to understand the etiology of these things or their pathophysiology or how to describe a patient who presents clinically, you're going to have to think about the whole hierarchy. Like it's not super clinically useful to say a person has a lot of psychopathology. Like what are you going to do with that, practically speaking? But nevertheless, there is some evidence that you can think about a general factor because everything's correlated with everything else. So again, to make a long story short, potential etiologic factors, right, like underlying genomic factors or whatever, are going to be located in different parts of that hierarchy. And there's, evidence for that. And not a difficult thing. This, like, I can give you an example of how this would work, right? Like, there's propensity to experience externalizing kinds of problems, right? So acting out, doing things that would be grounds for arrest, acting impulsively, acting in a way that's antagonistic to other people, right? Those things tend to coalesce into this broad externalizing spectrum. But, you know, people with an externalizing propensity are at a higher risk of developing substance use problems than people at a lower externalizing propensity. But the specific substance is going to have a lot to do with the ability to metabolize specific substances. So, right, there are etiologic factors at different levels. Like a person with a high externalizing propensity who's attracted to substances because of that propensity, presumably, right, might not be able to develop alcohol dependence, right, as opposed to dependence on some other substance, because they can't metabolize alcohol like another person who is able to metabolize large amounts of alcohol, you know, because of metabolic factors that have nothing to do with the externalizing propensity, but are sort of separate and at a lower level of the hierarchy. So that's the key to understanding this, right? That there are etiologic factors at different levels of you know, breadth or abstraction. And so you can't really think about alcoholism relevant genes as separate from externalizing relevant genes, although there are going to be things within there, right, that have different positions within the hierarchy. So I don't know. That's a pretty complicated set of things to try to describe briefly and, you know, verbally. But hopefully I've done an okay job with it, because again, there's a literature, right, a scientific literature that kind of supports what I'm saying here that, you know, the interested listener might want to get into. But that's basically how that seems to work, right? And I think there's fairly good evidence for what I've tried to articulate.
So let me ask you now a question specifically about personality disorders. So what do you make of the way they are currently understood and classified?
Well, right. So this question is a very it's a sort of like a specific subfield of the general stuff we've been talking about, right? So historically, personality disorders and their classification have emerged from clinical observation. And so there's a, you know, historical psychiatric literature based on observing certain kinds of patients, finding that some have very significant interpersonal challenges, right, that go beyond just mood symptoms or psychotic symptoms or whatever. And it's kind of that observation that some people's psychopathology manifests itself in very interpersonal ways that gives rise to this putatively separate group of conditions called the personality disorders. And, you know, the DSMs, at least up through DSM-4, talk about this in terms of categories, right? So DSM-4 posits 10 discrete categories: personality disorder, as well as personality disorder not otherwise specified, and says, you know, based on this basic paradigm, like, find the right one, right? So is this person more like schizotypal personality disorder, right? So having odd or eccentric beliefs and being sort of socially withdrawn, versus more like borderline personality disorder, which is emotional dysregulation, interpersonal dysregulation, transient stress-related dissociation, like a whole host of different things that are supposed to be relevant to borderline. And you got to pick the right label, basically, as the clinician. So that doesn't work, right? In the same way that, generally speaking, classical categorical approaches don't work, because you see persons who you might think of as having significant personality pathology, and you try to put them in these boxes, and it doesn't really work because they have presentations that intermingle all the different features of the different 10 disorders. And that's what led to these alternatives that are now, you know, kind of the main focus of the personality disorders literature, the DSM-5's alternative model of personality disorders, and the ICD-11 personality disorder system, which is very similar. And those, you know, look like what we were talking about before, right? They say there are these broad dimensions, right, that are very similar to a darker version of the Big Five. And when you think about a person, you want to think about kind of their position within those dimensions. They have the added element of the overall kind of construct of personality disorder. You know, this is criterion A in the alternative model. which has to do with self and other, functioning, right? Like, do you have a clear and consistent conception of who you are from time to time and place to place? And do you relate to other people in a way that might be considered adaptive? And it's the combination of those things that kind of defines personality disorder in these modern classification systems. And so the approach is very similar to what we've been discussing overall, right? How much interpersonal and self dysfunction is there, right? That's criterion A. And then what's the patterning across major dimensions of personality? That's criterion B, again, in the AMPD approach. And that's, a prominent approach now because it works better, right? Like, that's a much more, I would say, clinically useful way to describe real patients versus trying to put them into these categories that just don't capture actual clinical presentations.
So let me ask you now about one last topic that is very different from what we've been talking about. What is subjective well-being?
Well, again, like, a substantial literature exists, right, talking about what subjective well-being is. I have been influenced by Carol Riff's conceptualization of what she has called psychological well-being, because Carol is a close colleague, and she and I worked together on the midlife in the United States study, right, the big MIDAS study. I've worked with a lot of those measures and data, and there's many elements to it. But if you had to succinctly describe the essence of well-being, it's a sense that things are going well for you and your place in the world is secure, right? I guess if I had to put it in one quick phrase. And of course, that's something that all human beings strive toward, right? Everybody would like to have a sense of psychological well-being. And there's just different ways that it can be manifest. So I think that's another one of these hierarchical and multidimensional kinds of situations similar to psychopathology, right? It's a sense that you're doing well. I mean, we could talk about it in terms of varieties of happiness too, right? To bring that construct into play, right? So there's eudaimonic and hedonic versions of well-being, right? Hedonic being I feel good, right? I have pleasant emotional experiences. And eudaimonic, my life has a sense of meaning and purpose. I think it's the combination of those two things that sort of epitomize human flourishing, right? That's the stuff that you'd like to achieve as a human being, right? That you're generally in a positive mood hedonically, and also that you have a sense that life is meaningful, right? That you have pursuits and goals and things that you're trying to do that bring you joy and engagement with life in spite of all of its multifaceted challenges.
So you mentioned eudaimonic and hedonic well-being. What about social well-being?
Yeah, that's a good point, right? Connections with important others is certainly a key element of well-being also. And one could think about sort of a three-dimensional kind of structure that recognizes the social aspects as potentially separate or separable, but these things tend to be pretty correlated with each other, right? And they tend to be reciprocal in their relationship with each other. So, for example, people who have a disposition toward positive moods, right? It could be argued that disposition, that tendency to be in a good mood, regardless of what's going on, right, promotes extroverted behavior. So, right, you can think about extroversion, the personality trait, like being outgoing and friendly and engaged with other people and enjoying social interactions, as having a positive emotional core. And that's how, many theorists at the intersection of personality and mood, like, David Watson and Leanna Clark and people like that have talked about it based on evidence, right? That, extroverted behaviors have a positive emotional core. People who are in a good mood like to engage with other people because that's a normal human thing to do when you're in a good mood. Well, you could go on a podcast and have, conversations about interesting topics, right? Like, it requires a certain amount of positive mood, right? Being in a good frame of mind to want to engage socially. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, yeah, you can think about different manifestations in the social world, in the subjective, sort of world too, right? Like, there's a difference between, like, how am I perceiving myself subjectively and what am I doing interpersonally? But they tend to be reciprocal, right? Correlated with each other. because they have this, cyclic kind of aspect to them where they kind of bounce off each other and mutually reinforce a kind of sense of well-being in the world.
So one last question then. Is there any relationship between subjective well-being and personality traits?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And when I think about that, they tend to want to be located in that extroversion kind of space.
Okay.
Right. So I think there's a literature on this, right? That the mood space and the personality space are closely related to each other. Right. So the different mood dispositions can be thought of as having something to do with the extroversion neuroticism space, right? And are closely related to each other. So I guess that's how I would think about that. Right? That there's an affective basis for a lot of what is considered personality, because what those personality dispositions are driven by is affective dispositions. So just the tendency to be in certain kinds of mood states, if you think about them over time, right, can be thought of as personality dispositions. And they have, intrapersonal and interpersonal manifestations. And that's kind of the essence of what's going on with, extroversion and neuroticism, right? That those big trait domains have a lot to do with a person's mood dispositions.
Right. So I mean, does that mean then that if someone scores high on extroversion, then they tend to also have higher subjective well-being, and if someone scores high on neuroticism, it's the opposite then?
The way you said it makes it sound like they're sort of one dimension, but they're kind of orthogonal dimensions, right? So
Okay.
So the key thing to sort of recognize there is that a person can have simultaneous propensities toward dysregulated mood and positive mood. It's maybe sounds a little hard to put together psychologically, but if you think about it a little bit, it kind of maybe makes more sense. So, and it makes sense, I want to say like phylogenetically, like when you think about, systems in the brain and their origins, right, in evolutionary history and things like this, right? There are systems for dealing with the potential for threat, and there are systems for dealing with the potential for reward, and they're separable systems. So you can imagine a human organism that has high levels of both, right? And that would be a person who's outgoing, friendly, engaged, and also anxious and worried. That's not too difficult of a person to imagine. I can imagine people like this and have known people like this, right? They want to engage with people. They're very excited. They're extroverted and outgoing, but they're also very worried and concerned and a lot of anxiety. And it's like those things can happen simultaneously in a person's personality, I guess is the point I'm trying to make. And that's consistent with the structure of personality and mood, right? That those are separable dimensions.
Mm-hmm. Right. So just before we go, where can people find you and your work on the internet?
In the usual scholarly resources, I guess, right? So you could have a Google Scholar page, right? I'm not particularly engaged with social media because I find that to be kind of difficult and distracting, right? When I'm trying to sort of concentrate on academic work. One could spend a lot of time, and many people do, on academic social media, right? Arguing about things or engaging with colleagues. And I've never loved that, just in terms of how I want to spend my time. Although I understand that there are potential implications for me interacting with the world by not being super active on social media. But I like to think about these things in a more maybe old-fashioned way, right? Like that my scientific publications are more thought through than me firing off some social media post in response to some provocation, right? So I don't think I would do well with the dynamic aspects of social media. So I don't really have a presence there. But yeah, you can find my webpage at the University of Minnesota. You can find my Google Scholar profile. I don't mind emails, right? Like I have an easier time responding one-on-one to people when I know the context of the conversation, right, than broadcasting something to the whole world. Social media often feels to me like yelling into a void. And maybe some people are listening, but everybody's yelling, right? And it
Yeah.
doesn't. It's hard for me to conceptualize it as bringing together communities based on well thought out, kinds of ideas, because everything's so spontaneous and sudden. But maybe I'm just old fashioned that way, and I should get with the times and be more engaged with it. But currently, I don't really do much of that kind of activity.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough, and interesting insights on social media. So, but I will be leaving then links to your university page and your Google Scholar page in the description of the interview. And thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been really nice to talk with you.
No, I really appreciate your very thoughtful questions. You certainly hit on things that are very deep, right? And not easy to deal with succinctly. So hopefully I did okay. It felt a bit like a final examination, not for decades. But that's okay. I think those are really kind of the key questions that you were asking. So hopefully your listeners know a little bit more about it and know where to find me if they want to converse further.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Mark Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Fortiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Erringbon, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Zigoren, Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers: Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alni Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.